All right, we're live after our fancy countdown. Let's see. Already got 7 people jumping in here. This is going to be recorded, so if you don't get the opportunity to go live, you can watch it and record. And then as well, I'm going to do the same one again on Monday, which will also be recorded. And I'll attempt to answer more questions on Monday based on the questions we get today. So feel free throughout all of this to ask questions in the chat, and we'll save those questions to the end and then try to go through and answer as many questions as possible. Um, Again, today we are talking about the CPI guides. We kind of spent a lot of time developing some details in the guides, both on the player side and the director side. So today, just going to kind of run through what each of those look like and try to answer some questions prior to next week. And then middle of next week, we will then go ahead and launch registrations live. And I'll do 2 more sessions where we talk specifically about creating your registration and what that might look like, um, especially at the regional level. So we'll start here today with a quote. And this is fitting for CPI and moving into the season. The goal is to turn data into information and information into insight. And that's really what we're looking to do with CPI is gain insight on our players and take some of that gray area away from directors where, players want to play at this level and you think they should play at a different level. So hopefully that is progress we make. All right, some topics for today. Going to fly through some of them a little quicker than others. We'll look at the introduction to CPI, which we've done before. We will quickly go through how it's calculated. We will look at CPI in the player's guide and maybe a key point in there. We will jump over to the director's guide. We'll look at how CPI was spread out in the director's guide, which covers both USA and Canada separately, based on the population, the number of players, the PPRs and CPI of these players you can see in the guide. Canada and USA will use a different tier structure when it comes to CPI at their events. We'll discuss the importance of flexibility, especially at the regional level. I'll just show a graphic at the end there that I've shown before, why CPI, and then we'll look ahead a little bit at registrations, what's to come, and I'll try to answer all the questions I can there at the end. All right. Well, first off, if you've been in the player app over the last few days, you can see that CPI and PPR have earned a new home. They are growing and right in the middle of the screen. So if you are in there and players are looking and they see the info button right there, that info button that I'm circling with the mouse, that info button is going to take them right to the CPI guide on the website. And so if we were to click that button, we would be going to iplaycornhole.com/CPI. So let's do it. Go switch my screen over here. All right. iplaycornhole.com/CPI. We've added a bunch of data here and a bunch of information that is relevant to players mostly, but it's good for anybody to read and kind of catch up on where we're going in the season. Now, the table of contents here has grown, and I think one important part of that table of contents here is what if I do not have a CPI? That's a great question for players and directors. It's something that we're all going to have to work through this season. I do view this similar as to a player coming into an event last year. Maybe you're running a regional and a brand new player shows up. They're creating an account and they don't have a skill level. It's kind of the same thing. What if I don't have a skill level? In my opinion, translates a lot to what if I do not have a CPI? So we'll get to that as we head down that way. So on the website, you can see, what is CPI? Why is it a premier metric? How is it calculated? This gives players a really good insight into some of the data that goes into it. factors that are influencing the strength of schedule. Um, the purpose of CPI in the ACL, which is something we've been talking about a lot the last 12 months. Structuring competition, categorizing players and fostering fair competitions, the goal of this. And then the big one here, what if I do not have a CPI? Now, if a player does not have a CPI, there's a few bullet points we can have them look at to help determine where they might want to play or where the director might feel they should play. You can use a player's PPR. If they have a recent PPR from other events they played in, um, if they have experience with other software and they have a PPR, maybe a player comes in and says, "Hey, I have a 7 PPR. I haven't played much ACL. Where do you think I should fit?" That type of thing. So that's the one question. You can also look to ask, "Hey, are you a brand new player?" Brand new players that maybe had done some cornhole in the backyard, or they went camping and they saw people throwing cornhole and they wanted to join a local league. That brand new player, they're probably going to fit in a new division where the max CPI might be around a 5. Probably a Division 4 or a Division 5 player if we're running 5 tiers. Players that might have local experience playing in other events, then they just don't have a CPI yet. They might be suited for those tiers between a 5 and a 7 CPI. And then, as a club, regional, state director, we will have access to see some advanced stats and other metrics that might help guide. As players are throwing in our events and maybe they haven't met the metric yet to have a CPI at 50 games and 150 rounds. As a director, you'll still be able to see what CPI is building in the background. So maybe they've only played at one local weeknight. You'll be able to see, hey, this player is developing towards like a 6 CPI, even though the player can't see that yet. So, using these pointers with players, kind of helping guide players to these, will help us make decisions on where they should play. Understanding how CPIs fit into tiers. This gives players a good idea of like, hey, you're likely going to have the ability to play up. Um, in certain scenarios, directors might say, hey, in this blind draw, you cannot play down. We don't want players playing down. We don't want tier 5 players playing up in blind draw. So that would be an option as well here. Kind of covers blind draw in that guide as well. All right. That kind of covers, information that the player might really want to find on CPI and how it affects them, and just kind of pointing them towards this table of contents where they can cover each of these bullet points. Again, they can get directly to this from their player app. They can also just go to the website and go to iplaycornhole.com/CPI. Gonna close that one. Go back to the other one just real quick. I don't have a quick way of doing that. It takes me a moment here. All right, sharing that back. And now we can jump over to the director's guide. So, the director's guide has been out now for a short amount of time. And we went in today and we added 2 new tabs in the table of contents, CPI for USA directors, and what we'll be actually saying CPI for Canada directors, not international. So that's going to be Canada specific. Now, by clicking on those 2 tabs, that will take you directly to that section of the guide. I do want to note that a lot of the information and the ideas behind those 2 are very similar. The difference is just going to be the range of CPI used for Canada or for USA, whether it comes to a provincial event, a state event, Canada Open or USA Open, or any of us running our regionals. So we'll jump out of this one real quick again. Jump into another screen over here. And we have the director's guide. So like I said, director's guide has been out for a short period of time. Hopefully you've had the opportunity to look through that. If you did bring questions today, please start throwing them in the chat, and I will get to those towards the end. But we will kind of cover the CPI for USA directors and then Canada directors as well. So shooting all the way down in the guide, um, it starts by describing CPI, and one of the first bullet points, very important, I think, for all of us to learn is what if a player does not have a CPI? Now, I just talked about that from the player's point of view, and we also have that same question coming from the director's point of view. So there's a few bullet points here for the directors to help guide a player if they do not have a CPI. The first one, ask guiding questions, start a conversation about that player's experience. Are they new? Like I said, camping, backyard. Do they have experience at the local bars or in other leagues? This can really help us determine where we think they should be playing prior to having CPI. Looking at other metrics, if they use other softwares, if they know what they might have for an average PPR, it's a good starting point to kind of determine what tier they might fall into at your regional event or even your local event. Like I mentioned before, utilizing the admin portal, we're adding a feature called admin player search, and this will help get a lot of information on players prior to the player seeing what their CPI is. Also, what we're keeping this year in the background for the admin, for the directors to see, is what the player's previous skill level was last year in the software prior to us removing it from the players page. So you will be able to see last year what skill level a player had. Maybe they had a competitive and they yet don't have a CPI. You would be able to see that they were competitive last year. And I just put this note here. This one has been pretty strong as we look at data and we look through the CPI. Doing a PPR versus CPI check. If a player knows their PPR is a 7, it's generally and most common that their CPI is going to be a half a point to a full point lower. So if I were to say, hey, my PPR is a 7.1, it's common that my CPI might be around a 6.1 or 6.5, anywhere from that half a point to a full point lower. And so we'll continue to watch that all year and see how that affects us. What you can see is we've developed some national tiers. This would be what you will find at a USA Open. These tiers took all of the players in the country and split them into groups based on what we felt fit. A formerly open player, formerly advanced player, competitive, intermediate, and novice. So we have those national tiers here. You can see the chart, and you can see tier 2, which was formerly advanced. Those players are generally falling into that category this year of 7.25 to an 8.25. And again, that's at the national and the ACL Open level, the largest events where the most players will be attending. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on state today. We're going to skip kind of through that. We'll talk about that closer to state events, but feel free to look at those. But I do want to talk about regional, because regional is where that flexibility is going to be very important. And it's also going to be a learning curve for a lot of us. So I'm going to be running regionals. I'm going to be learning a lot about that flexibility and how that fits my group. It's going to be different than how that might affect a group in Texas or Virginia or New York. Going to be different for all of us, and that's why we really want to allow some flexibility there, so regional directors can really fit their player base and help ensure that players are playing where they think they should. So, just like last year, you could run a regional with 5 tiers if you wanted. A lot of directors ran regionals with 4 tiers, and I think most commonly what we're seeing in smaller areas is directors running regionals with 3 tiers, where they were skipping that advanced level. So that will be similar this year. As CPI tiers are in place of skill levels, you're going to want to kind of decide, hey, based on my group, am I running 4 tiers, which would be a tier 1, 2, 3, and 4? Or am I just going to go down to 3 with a smaller group and run 1, 3, and 4, similar to last year? And so you can see the number at 5 tiers stays the same as what it would nationally. and you'll have some flexibility there. If you run 4, you'll just kind of drop off that novice division. And if you run 3, I got a typo there. Dropped the E. You would be kind of dropping that advanced and that novice to run 3. And looking at this here, you see some of these flexibility available. So, looking at tier 3, the national number for tier 3 goes all the way up to 7.25. Now, a regional director might think that's too high of a number for their area. I think for my area personally, that's going to be too high. A regional director would have the opportunity to bring that number all the way down to 6.25. And I think in my area, I'm going to try that out. I'm going to try a 6.25 out for that competitive player, that competitive level. And what that's going to do is actually a lot of people who played competitive last year who were finding actually have a CPI of like a 6.6. That's not going to allow them to play competitive at my regionals any longer. And it's going to take maybe a month or two for us all to kind of work together and develop what that perfect number is for our area. But I think for me, I have a smaller area, I have a smaller player base. I would like to see those players that have the mid 7 PPRs, which translates kind of that mid 6 CPI. I want to see those players playing up. And so that's one way I'm going to have to kind of split that group up. We'll look at specific number later of a player that had a high 6 CPI and what they looked like last year and maybe where they're going to be playing this year. So, the blind draws, that's the next one here. That's going to be something we also have flexibility on. Blind draws, a lot of times last year, we didn't want players to play up. We're going to run a competitive blind draw. We wanted to try to have as many competitive players as we could. Now we're looking at running a tier 3 blind draw. We want to build that range to keep those tier 3 players together. Try to avoid the tier 4 players playing up and getting partnered with a tier 3 player when tier 3 players don't necessarily want that. Now, we're always going to have the opportunity to combine divisions, just like last year. If you don't have enough players, you're going to be able to combine. This is just our starting point, like last year. Starting point was I want to run intermediate blind draw. I would open up a registration this year for tier 4 and have the opportunity for players to register there. If I don't get enough, then I'll be able to move that tier 4 group and combine with tier 3 to make one larger blind draw, just like we could last year to an intermediate and competitive or competitive and open. These are just going to be our starting points. And next week, as we look at the actual registrations, we'll kind of get a better feel for how we move those numbers up and down. Some directors going to run just 3 tiers. That might be myself, kind of dropping what was advanced last year at the regional level and just running tier 1, tier 3, and tier 4. So I'll have some flexibility there. You can see on what my max CPI would be. And naturally, when it comes to singles and doubles, we're not going to set a minimum to start because I want players to be able to play up. Now, if you're someone that does not want players to play up, you will have the flexibility to set a minimum number. So you could set a tier 3 minimum CPI based on your player base to not allow lower players to play up. Now, in my case, and I think in most common cases across the country, we want players to be able to play up. That's going to be how they improve, right? That's how they're going to get a better CPI, how they're going to earn points a little bit higher level within your state, within your regional events. And so I think general practice is we should have players play up. I know that's not everywhere across the country. And I know in Canada, especially at the open level, they might prefer that players don't play up. And so we'll have flexibility there. You will be able to set a minimum number. We're just going to default that number to allow players to play up. And then, local club events, similar to last year, kind of a standard 3-tier system. Tier 1, which was formerly open. Tier 3, last year it was competitive. Tier 4, last year that would have been intermediate. And so kind of the same thing here with these charts. Just give you a baseline and go from there. Going over to the Canada side, just want to talk through that. A lot of the verbiage here is all the same. It's going to have the same starting point. What if the player does not have a CPI? You can go right through that. Okay. What you'll notice though, as you go to the Canada national numbers, you'll notice that their CPI metrics are about 0.75 lower than the USA metrics. We looked at all Canada players that have a CPI in the system. We used a similar scale to what we were doing on the USA side. And Matt in Canada, the national director, and I both feel confident that this range here fits Canada a lot better than just forcing what we have as a USA number onto Canada. Didn't make a lot of sense when we looked at their player base and where their players at. We're watching their players elevate in CPI quickly, and they will be catching up to us probably this year, this season. But we're going to start out the season with these numbers here. Whereas you can see a tier 2 advanced Canada at their opens. If you go to a Canadian Open, it would look like 6.5 to 7.5, where USA number looked like a 7.25 to 8.25. So it's about a 0.75 difference. And that's at the open level. Okay. Scrolling down, they got their province numbers. I'll skip through those for now and go to the regional events. In the regional events, you can see we've got tables here for Canadian numbers, and they all, like I said, are about 0.75 lower than what you're going to find on the USA side. And that's just to make sure that the players are playing against the right competition and they are playing against people who have similar CPIs as themselves and getting an opportunity to either grow their CPI or what they might realize is their CPI, their PPR is higher and they might be on the decline. It's going to be one of the two. So it was important that we allowed that for both Canada and US. All right, I'm going to jump off of this one, go back to the other one. Again, if you have questions, throw them in the chat. Looks like we might have one or two following in there now. Throw them out there. I'll answer them today. And then what I'll do is take those questions and integrate them into Mondays as well to help Monday's group, which will be the same seminar, just maybe a different group of people that aren't available right now. All right, so moving on, just want to kind of show a couple of graphs that just give you an idea of where the player base is at. These numbers are relatively true both in the USA numbers and the Canadian numbers. And so what we'll see, our largest group of players, tier 3 and tier 4 is covering over 60% of the player base. So that's a really important group there. It's a majority of our players that are playing on weeknights. It's players that might be going to some regionals, and they're just kind of in that CPI range, of like a 5.25 to a 7.25. That CPI range of 2 there, right? 5.25, 7.25 on the USA side is 60% of the player base. That's why flexibility is going to be so important at the regional level because it's going to be different everywhere. The regional players that I have, the regional players that are happening in other states, we want to be able to flex around that number. This is a similar graphic here, again, showing that tier 1 is really only 5% of our player base across both Canada and the US. That number, when you go down to a regional event, we need that to be able to grow. So we have people playing tier 1. And that's why that flexibility is going to be important. I might be able to drop that down, all the way to 6.75 and have now, 20% of the players at my regional playing tier 1. Maybe I only have 30 players show up. I want to be able to get 10, maybe 30% of those players, 10 of the 30 up into tier 1. And then, of course, allowing players to play up. All right, this is going to be a couple slides just kind of showing that flexibility a little bit, trying to help that flexibility make sense on a graph. This would be 5-tier event, which I know is not common for regionals. But I just wanted to kind of show, looking at tier three, the national number would say everybody on this tier three bar would be playing tier three. Now at the regional level, I'd actually have the ability to say anyone in the dark blue here actually would have to play up. And so nationally and regionally, what looks at tier three will be different. Um, I would say at my regionals, I'm going to bump this dark blue group here from tier three, and I'm going to push them up. And maybe they go to an ACL Open and they're a tier three player. At my regional, they're going to be a tier two or a tier one player, and that's the same as last year, right? I know we all had those competitive players at home that wanted to go to an Open, but they just knew they couldn't compete with other competitive players at Opens. Competitive players at Opens were throwing 9 PPRs, right? And that's the same thing here. These tier three players at home might not be the same tier three players at Opens, and that's where you can kick this dark blue group up into the next segment at your regionals. This next one here is if I was going to run a three-tier regional, which is likely what I'm going to do. Like I said, I would knock this whole dark blue group right here from tier three at the national ranking, and I would bump them up into tier one at my regional. So this is flexibility that we have. And I might see, oh, I did it too strong, or I didn't do it strong enough. But what I could do is really just send the dark blue group up to the next tier. So hopefully that visual there helps make sense for you as a director. And as we talk about it next week, we'll show you how you're going to do that in the registration. Yeah, so I'm just kind of bumping that end cap of that tier up. All right, this one, I just want to talk a little bit again about why CPI. This slide is something that I've shown multiple times over the last 12 months. I'm using old data for this, but it's really relevant data still. Nothing changed on the data. It's really describing why moving away from skill levels and moving into CPI, it's going to really help align our players to be playing similar players. Take some of that gray area for us as directors out. Now, what we'll do is look at player A, right? Talked about this earlier. Player A, they have a 6.94 CPI. Now, last year, they had a skill level advanced. Maybe the director put them advanced. Maybe at their local level, they were advanced. But what we can see by looking at this player's data just real quickly, they throw an 8.07 PPR, pretty good, probably advanced at my regional. You can see that they have a negative DPR, so they're not throwing as well as the people around them, and they're only winning 46% of their games. So they're actually losing more than half their games, okay? But they're advanced, and they have a 6.9 CPI. We add in player B. This player also had a 6.9 CPI, the same CPI as player A. Last year, they were marked as competitive, okay, in their skill level. Maybe that's where they are locally. Maybe that's where their director set them. That's information, that we're looking at. They threw a lower PPR than player A, 7.4, but they were actually throwing better than the people they were playing against, and they were winning 60% of their games. 60% win percentage is actually quite large. So that tells me this player may have been playing intermediate and winning a lot, and they got bumped up, or they were playing competitive and they were just beating all the competitive players in their area, winning 2/3 of their games. And then we look at player C, also has a 6.94 CPI. Last year they were labeled intermediate. Somehow this intermediate player throws an 8.06 PPR, very similar to the player A. And interesting thing is they're actually throwing better than the people around them, and they're winning a whopping 70% of their games. That's way too much if they're actually playing at the intermediate level. If you came to my regional and you were marked intermediate and you jumped in my intermediate bracket, throwing an 8.06, you would quickly be winning 70% of your games. Now, that might not be true for other areas. If you go to Virginia or Texas, like I said, 8.06, maybe it is intermediate. I don't know. But what we're going to be able to do with CPI is have these three players have the opportunity to play each other. And then we'll really see whose CPI is going up, whose CPI is going down, whose win percentage is going up, and whose win percentage is going down. and we'll level out these 6.94 players. Some of them will go up and some of them will go down. So I just want to point that out. I'm really excited to see that happen, both at the local level, the regional level, and at the national level at the opens. All right. A couple quick screenshots for registration as we look forward to next year. Again, I'm not displaying or going through a registration today. It's not ready for that, but it will be here in the next couple of days. So I just want to show you what that might look like when you're creating a regional registration, right? You'll pick tier one singles from the drop down, and that will say on the director side formerly open. So it's going to give us some clues as to what it looked like last year and what we're doing this year. It's going to help us transition over out of that verbiage. But last year, tier one singles would have been open singles. We will have the opportunity to have a default, right? The default max CPI would be a 7.75. I'll have the opportunity to go up higher, and I'll have the opportunity to go down lower within a range predetermined in the registration. So as I go down in my area to like a 6.75 or 7.25, whatever that number makes sense to me, we will have charts over to the left that help remind you what those national numbers look like. And then looking at another one, a blind draw. Okay, blind draws get a little bit trickier. A lot of times, you want to keep that similar group in a blind draw. So you'll see some defaults that pop up. A tier three blind draw, which says formerly competitive, that's going to be defaulted to have a minimum and a maximum, which you'll be able to adjust both of those based on your area. So I just want to kind of show you that as a sneak peek into next Wednesday and next Friday when we have real registrations going on. I'll create one in real time with directors for my own regional for October, and then walk you guys through what yours would look like. All right. I just did a lot of talking there. I am 32 minutes in. I don't think I really stopped talking that whole time. Final thoughts for me. Definitely super excited. I've been talking about CPI for 18 months with directors. I've done many sessions last year as we learned about CPI. And I finally feel like we're getting ready to launch CPI. And with the launch of CPI, that's going to mean we're all going to learn a lot together, right? I don't have all the answers. Athena and does not have all the answers. But what we do have is the ability to support directors, work with all of your state directors, work with all the regional directors, and come up together things that we're learning and hold some town halls and make the CPI even better than at launch. One big thing I just want to point out, we're talking about advocates a lot as this season goes on, but when it comes to CPI and transitioning over, it's going to be really important that our directors are advocates for the change, right? If we have directors at a regional event that are just like, oh man, I hate CPI, CPI sucks, and they're telling all the players, you're advanced, you should be competitive, and they're not being advocates for the change, then it's going to make it really tough for our players to take that change and run with it. So just want to remind everybody, as we transition, it might be clunky, right? Things might not make a lot of sense in October to everybody, but let's all try to be advocates for the change, boost up CPI together, and then I think we'll all have a much better experience with CPI in general. And with that, all my talking, hopefully you get a chance to watch the recording if you didn't watch it live. I will take through some questions. I think Athena might be popping questions up for me. Let's give it a shot. And maybe she's not. Oh, she did. Perfect. Not a lot of questions I saw come through. First one from Daryl. Will we be able to sort swap by CPI? So initially, Daryl, as swap first comes through October, you'll be able to see player CPI in the swap, yes, but you're not going to be able to sort a final bracket by that from day one. And the reason there is that we actually want what happens in the swap to be important, right? Whether you're judging players based on how well they throw that day, their PPR, whether you want to judge them by their DPR or their win-loss records in the swap, that still needs to be priority. And what they do in the swap still needs to matter. And so the initial thought on CPI in swap, it really makes all of those games completely irrelevant. Now, what it does do, um, if you're thinking like just wanting to put the best players in group one and the next best players in group two, I totally understand that. And we're going to get to that point probably pretty quickly in October. But initially, I think when we first launch, I don't think it's going to be available. You will be able to see CPIs, but probably not sort by. All right, next one. Do the current season stats hold the most weight in the CPI algorithm? That's a great question. So they don't hold the most weight, no. However, the current season stats are what is driving the change in a player's CPI. So, as we flip over to October 1 and the season starts, the plan is to drop off, a player's PPR and DPR and all of their weighted events from 3 seasons ago. So we'll see initial change right away. But what that's going to do is going to make that sample size smaller for the player, which means the current season's numbers will have a bigger impact on that player's CPI. So not specifically weighted heavy or no, but it will be the driver of change. All right. We apply rules about max wins at certain levels. Example, 6.32 CPI wins tier 3 twice and still has a CPI under 7. And yeah, so this is a great question, Dustin. And we've done a lot of talking about this. We've kind of thought through some ways where we could make that happen, where a director could maybe go in, like last year, for example, right? If somebody won intermediate singles 2 months in a row, we would just go in and move their skill level to competitive, right? Then boom, they got to play competitive. Now with CPI, we can't go in and just change their CPI. So we're not going to have a direct way to do that. But as we get through October and we see how players' CPI is changing, what I'd like you to do, Dustin and other directors, if you have a scenario like that where this player just won your intermediate division, your tier 4 division in CPI, and you didn't see their number change enough to move them up. We will develop a way to where you can then, yes, force them up, but we're not going to utilize that in October, and we may want to actually do October and November before we put a change in, but the goal is yes. All right, next one, Dustin, Mr. Question. Can we add or adjust in rare situations CPIs? And how can they register with that one? So no, we're not going to be able to adjust them on the director side. When a player goes to register and they do not have a CPI, or if they do have a CPI for that matter, when they go into registration, the CPI is going to be floating right there in the middle of the screen. It's going to always let the player know what their CPI is. And there'll be an info button that says, what if I don't have a CPI? What do I need to do? And this is going to be those leading questions that help a player determine where they should play. So if I'm a player, I do not have a CPI, I'm going into a Florida regional registration. I will have some guiding questions there on the info button to help me determine where I should be playing. Now, it's just like last year, kind of like I said, if a player that did not have an account, they created a brand new account, they set themselves to whatever they wanted, and they played wherever they felt they should. So it's not going to be perfect, but we're not going to be able to adjust a CPI because that is literally just based on data. All right. Question from Daryl. In doubles, will a combined CPI be used for straight bracket play? Not exactly, Daryl. We're not going to do like, like set a 14 max CPI combined number where both players added together need to be under 14. We're looking at it a little different. We're still trying to stick to the tiers that we have in place. So as a director, if I run tier 3 doubles, the max CPI for tier 3, I set at 7. Both players on that doubles team will need to be under 7 CPI. Now, when a player goes to register, they're not only going to see their own CPI, they're also going to see their teammate's CPI. So they will have access to both of those in the registration when they go to register for your event. So it's not going to be 7 plus 7 equals 14. It's going to be both players needing to be individually under 7. All right. Does a player with a current CPI face a disadvantage to a new player without one? Um, yes, I think that's possible, Daryl. Players holding on to data from 2 years ago is probably going to be, bringing them down a little. But in the bigger scheme of things, their weighted win losses are going to be important, right? And playing this season in regionals and locals and state events and opens, that weighted win loss, that weighted percentage is going to actually impact them. So I don't see it being a disadvantage. I actually think it's really going to help key them into where they should be playing. All right. What is the benefit of using 3 tiers of data to calculate CPI versus only using a snapshot in time? That's a good question, Daryl. What we feel like is, 120 days snapshot, in my opinion, is not enough data to actually tell you the whole story about a player. What that does is allow a player to not play for a few months and then come in, and their data is greatly affected by one day's play. We don't want that. We don't want a player to come into one event with a CPI of 6.5 and leave that event with a CPI of 9.2. That's just not going to be possible. And that really doesn't tell the story of what that player is as a whole player. So I think it's really important that we're telling the story of that player's career and, particularly the last couple of seasons of their career. And we're not just doing that for one person, right? We're doing that for everybody. So it's collectively moving players up and down at a slower pace than if we just took the last 120 days. I might be throwing bad my PPR for the last 120 days. Maybe I'm not engaged, or maybe I'm injured, and there's other things like that that would have my PPR really down. That's still not telling the true story of who I am as a player, because I might actually be someone who really likes to throw airmails, and I actually have a good airmail. I don't want to all of a sudden show up with a 120-day CPI that plays against players that don't throw airmails or don't even think airmails are a quality shot. So that's kind of why that whole player is better. And how often CPI update? It's a great question, Mark. It's going to be updated 4 days a week. That's Monday through Thursday, once a day. So what that's going to do is that's really going to capture everything that happened over the weekend from a player and update them on Monday. And then we'll continue to update once a day based on some weeknight events that they play, and stop those updates right before going into the weekend. So that way, if I am playing at an open, or if somebody runs a 2-day regional and they have a Friday night blind draw and Saturday singles and doubles, we don't want that player's CPI to change on you in the registration during the weekend. So we're going to hold off those changes to let players get through the weekend, develop a whole change for them coming out on Monday. Really good question. Right. A lot of questions. Let's see. All right, Billy. Yep, rewatch it. And if you come up with questions, try to join us Monday. I'm going to do the same session on Monday, and try to get more of these questions answered during the session and ask for additional questions and answer those as well. Um, Regarding doubles, could we use an average CPI for both players to promote higher CPI players playing with lower players? That's something we could probably get to, Daryl, on local events first. Um, and we can certainly talk about that for regionals and and higher events. But what you're going to have to do, and then in those scenarios, as a director, is you're going to need to ensure that the higher average players are playing each other, because if my CPI is a 9 and I'm playing with someone who's got a 4, what you don't want is me going in and playing against the other person's teammate who also has, like a 5.5, and just destroying them. So We're not going to start out with that, but it's certainly something we can talk through and get to that point. Will regional directors and state directors be able to enter players into the division players should be playing in if they feel the CPI doesn't match the skill level? Jeff, that's something we're not going to do initially in October because what we're doing is developing that number as October runs through all the events. But yes, we, like I said earlier, talked about some ways where we'll be able to do that on the back end and say, hey, player, I know your CPI says you should be tier 4, but you're winning too much in my area, and I'm going to lock you into tier 3. So, yeah. All right, going back to my example, if a player registers for a regional weeks in advance and then it raises their CPI, what happens? And that's another great question. A couple things. Number one, when you go into your registration, you'll be able to see all the players' CPI. So you'll be able to see that someone's out of place if you're looking. My initial thought is, week to week, player CPI is not going to change drastically. So you're not going to have somebody that's like a 5 CPI register for tier 4, and then 7 days later they're an 8.5 CPI. That number, that range just won't happen. So we're not going to have big drastic changes, but what we are going to have is some changes, right? A player might go from a 5 to a 5.31, and that might miss your cutoff by a small amount. And that's where you, as the director, is going to make a decision for your events. Hey, when you register as a director, I'm going to allow you to be locked in, or as a director, I'm going to look right before my regional starts and I'm going to make adjustments where needed. So that's going to be up to the director and what they feel is best for the area. And I certainly recommend advertising that on your regional registration. So, my thought for my events is I'm not expecting a big change in players. I'm probably going to allow them to play where they registered, but I might not lock that in. So, when will those PPRs and DPRs reset? The drop down in this year's info. Yeah, that's going to happen right around the start of the year once we get through this registration change. And then I saw Mark also said, because eligible players when they registered while qualifying, yeah, that is going to be kind of the point we're all going to have to watch together. Is like if players are still qualifying for CPI or their new CPI is changing by a lot, we might run into that situation. But overall, majority of the 30,000 players that have CPI right now, that CPI is not going to change in big numbers. But something we all need to work together on. If you are seeing things in your area, bring them up to your state director for sure. And then, we'll talk about those things in town halls. We're going to run a lot of town halls this season with directors. And I just want to make sure we're all on the same page kind of as we develop through what CPI looks like. So a lot of really good questions. I've been talking for almost an hour, so maybe time to cut it off. But if you have questions, feel free to ask them, email them to me, put them in the directors group, or save them for next week. All right. We'll be back on Monday to do the same session a little bit later. That'll be 8 o'clock Eastern, 5 o'clock Pacific time. We'll run through the same slides, talk about CPI in the same ways. I'll try to answer the questions as best I can. And like I said, this is going to be one big team effort, guys. I'm really looking for this to be a team. I don't have all the perfect answers, and I need all of you guys to help develop this program together to make it the best program about skill levels that we can. So thank all of you for being in here and look forward to talking with you again.